In 1971, after the plane she was flying in was struck and destroyed by lightning, Juliana Kopka would be sent into a 10,000-foot free fall above the Earth. Miraculously, she would not only survive this fall, but she would go on to navigate her way through the Amazon rainforest over the next 2 weeks in order to find help. If this is something that interests you, join me this week as I talk about Juliana Kopka, the girl who survived a 10,000-foot free fall. On December 24th, 1971, Juliana Kopka and her mother Maria boarded a flight in Lima, Peru to go back and be with their father in the Peruvian rainforest. Originally, the plan had actually been for them to travel the day before, but Julianne had just graduated from high school, and the day before was their graduation ball, their prom. And she had begged her mom to be able to stay one more day so she could have this experience, and her mom relented and said, "You know what? It's a big deal to you. We'll stay one more day. What's the worst that can happen?" Unfortunately, because they left on the 24th now instead of the 23rd, all of the airlines were booked. And the only available flight that they could find was on an airline called Lansa. Now, Lansa, before they had left, her father had specifically told her mom, "Whatever you do, do not fly Lansa." And the reason being is they had sort of a reputation. See, in the past decade, they'd had two different crashes with this airline. In fact, the airplane they were flying on was the only airplane that this airline had left because all the other ones had crashed. But Marie's mom wanted to be home for Christmas, and she decided to bite the bullet and figured, you know what? What's the worst that could happen? So they went ahead and boarded the flight. They took their seats in the back of the airplane. They were on the second to last row. Julianne was on the window where she could see the Indians as they passed over them. Her mom was in the middle seat, and on the left side was just a man on the aisle seat. The first 30 minutes of this flight were smooth sailing. There was a Christmas spirit in the air. Everybody was getting ready to go home and be with their families for Christmas. Weather was wonderful as well. It was clear skies, there weren't any clouds or even any turbulence at all. And the pilots already had begun their final descent. They were only 20 minutes away from the airport when all of a sudden this freak thunderstorm appeared out of nowhere. There was lightning and rain, and it went from a night and day difference of this beautiful weather to as dark as could be and super turbulent. Now, the plane they were flying in was a turboprop Electra desert plane. It's a plane that had already been phased out of the United States for passenger service, and the reason is because it was a desert plane. And why that matters is normally on an airplane, you have your fuselage and you have your wings, and they're not directly attached. This way, there's a little bit of bend in the wings if you run into, let's say, turbulence or a thunderstorm. Unfortunately, on a desert plane, the wings are directly sealed and welded to the fuselage. So if you run into any turbulence, like a sudden surprise thunderstorm over the Andes, all of a sudden it's really hard to control the airplane. The freak thunderstorm caught everyone off guard, including the pilots. This is the 1970s. They don't have the weather prediction technology that we have nowadays. Pilots had already begun their final descent though, and so they decided that, you know what, we're going to go ahead and push on through to the airport because they're only 20 minutes away. Meanwhile, back with the passengers, complete pandemonium had broken out. Christmas presents had begun falling from the overhead compartments. The drinks and snacks that had been served earlier began sloshing around. Several people began screaming. And Julianne, sitting in the back of the airplane, hearing all of this happening, all of a sudden there's this bright flash of light that comes across the airplane, and a bolt of lightning strikes the right propeller. And the last thing that Julianne remembers hearing was her mom next to her saying, "Now it's all over." And Julianne all of a sudden has this weird sensation. See, she's sitting in the back of the plane, and all of a sudden she could realize that she can see the aisle, all the passengers, even up into the cockpit. And the reason this is because Julianne is no longer attached to the plane. Her seat has become completely detached, and she's now flying outside of the airplane. And she looks over and she realizes that the man who was on the aisle seat is no longer attached to the seats, as well as her mom's gone. She's completely alone. And she begins a free fall 10,000 feet in the air. She immediately passes out. She wakes up a couple minutes later, still in a free fall, but this time she's hanging upside down, and the only thing she can see in front of her is the Amazon rainforest coming at her very, very quickly. And before she can make impact, She passes out again. I just want to stop real quick and explain why they were on this plane in the first place, why they were even in the rainforest. See, Julian's father Wilhelm had got his doctorate in the early 1950s in post-war Germany. He decided he wanted to go to Peru and study the Amazon rainforest, something that hadn't really been done at that point. So he journeyed out to Peru and got a job at a university, began teaching, and then taking these week-long trips into the rainforest to study. Soon after, his fiancee, Maria, followed behind him and they got married in Peru, and she began doing the same thing. They would teach and then they would go and study. And it was in this environment that Julianne was born in 1954. She only went back throughout her childhood once to Germany. So at home, she would speak German with her parents, and then at school and with her friends, she would speak Spanish. And in the 1960s, in 1967, her parents decided they wanted to focus solely on research. So they set up a research center in the Amazon rainforest. I'll kind of explain more about this later, but suffice it to say, it was in the boonies. And so they homeschooled Julianne for about 2 years as they would do this research in the rainforest. At this point, the government actually stepped in. They were kind of like, we know you said you've been homeschooling your daughter, but how do we really know? So they forced Julianne to go back to Lima, where she would finish her studies in Lima. And it was she just graduated from high school this December, and that was the reason she was now with her mom flying back to be with her dad, because now that she had graduated, she could go back and live full time with her parents. Against all odds, Julianne survives the fall. She wakes up, it's pouring rain, and it's pitch black, and she can't really process anything that's happened yet. The only thing she really notices is that her seatbelt's unfastened, which makes her think that she might have already woken up before. But she quickly stops thinking about that, just curls up in a ball, tucks herself more into the seat, and falls back asleep. Now, you might be wondering at this point, how did she even survive the fall? And that's a really good question. And the answer is nobody knows, because it's such a freak accident. And I mean, it's really hard to repeat that. And it's harder to get volunteers to throw out of airplanes and say, let's see if you survive. And if you survive, tell us how you did it. But the first theory is that there's a lot of updrafts. That's when the wind just is blowing up. And so this creates a lot more drag and air resistance, so you don't fall as fast. The second thing is, if you recall, when she fell out of the airplane, the man that was with her and her mom were no longer there with her. And so because of that, she flipped upside down and she began spinning in this seat. It was these three seats connected together, and she began spinning like a helicopter blade, which helped slow her fall. Just think of like when I was a kid, we'd play with the maple seeds. We called them helicopters, and you would drop them, and they spin to the ground, and they don't fall nearly as fast as they would. And that's kind of what happened. And then the third thing they think is now that she's falling to the ground head first, right when she hit the rainforest, they think the foliage somehow miraculously flipped her back up so she wouldn't just splat on the ground. So then she hit the ground and the seat absorbed most of the impact. Really rare events, but when they all worked together, she survived the 1 in a million odds and was now alive. So Julianne wakes up. It's now the first day after the crash. It's Christmas Day, although she doesn't realize it yet, and she tries to stand up, and she's too nauseous and dizzy and has to sit back down. And the reason is because she's suffering from a severe concussion. She also has a host of other injuries. Just want to list them off here real quick. Besides the severe concussion, she has her left eye completely swollen shut, her right eye is swollen shut to the point where it's just a slit that she can see out of. She has a broken collarbone, as well as she has a 1 inch gouge in her leg, as well as a gouge in her arm. She's unaware, but she also has a spinal injury, as well as she's torn a ligament in one of her legs. And the only possession she has on her at this moment is she has one sandal and her sundress she was wearing in the plane, and the zipper's now busted in the back. So Julianne tries to stand up for over the next hour. She has this process of standing up, getting too dizzy and nauseous, and having to sit back up and doing this again and again. Eventually, though, she's able to stand up and not collapse, and so she begins walking her way around the seat from the airplane. The reason she does this is, well, one, she wants to see if she can find any survivors or maybe anything that can help her. And the second thing is she's trying to orient herself, because she knows that one of the biggest dangers is that she might, with a concussion, just wander off into the woods looking for help and lose the wreckage and lose any chance of at least trying to find help. While she's doing this, she finds a little bag of sweets, which is the only food that she finds and she's going to have for the next 2 weeks, as well as she hears a search plane overhead. Unfortunately, the Amazon rainforest looks something like this, and there's no way for a search plane to be able to see her. So even though she cries out and yells for help, she realizes that if she stays where she is right now, she'll never be able to get any help because the people won't be able to find the wreckage. So she decides, you know what, I'm going to leave and try to find a clearing where I can get some help. And she recalls the story that her dad told her when she was living in the rainforest about a boy who got lost in a nearby village. And he was lost for 2 days. But the way he was able to get help was he found a little stream, followed that stream to a river, and followed that to a village. And so her dad had told her that if you ever get lost, find running water, follow its course, and it will lead you to people. So she begins listening, and she hears a nearby little stream, and finds that stream and begins following it. So as day 2 arrives, Julianne continues to follow the stream. And all day long she can hear search planes flying overhead, and she stops and she yells out, but it's infuriating because there's no way that they're able to see her or hear her. But it gives her a little bit of hope because she knows that all she has to do is get to an open spot and they'll be able to find her. And if there's this many planes out here, she assumes there must be other survivors. They must be rescuing other people. So it's only a matter of time before help will arrive for me. Going back to when the plane went missing, when the plane didn't show up at its scheduled time at first, the airport didn't panic. They figured because of the storm it might have been delayed, they might have rerouted, maybe it hadn't even left. But as the hours ticked by and they realized that indeed the plane had left and that there's no way it could be flying anymore because it would have run out of gas by now, a search began. From the very beginning, the search was hampered by the weather. The worst was they had no idea where the plane was. Because of the thunderstorm, they thought maybe the plane had rerouted, or maybe that they had tried going to a different airport or tried an emergency landing, or maybe it stayed on the original flight path, but they were unsure. And the reason they couldn't figure this out is because of the thunderstorm. The thunderstorm creates a lot of sound. Not only lightning, but it also created landslides in the nearby area. And they didn't realize that some of the reports they were getting about the sound of an explosion nearby was not the sound of a plane blowing up, but mud collapsing, creating these big booms. And so because of all these false reports that they were getting, at a certain point, the government just had to say, you know what, we're not listening to any more of these because all of these leads have been false up to this point, even though there was a couple of true ones in there. And they also declared a media blackout because the newspapers kept repeating this false information. And when it came to the actual searching, there was thunderstorms for several days. And it made visibility next to zero, or very hard, and it made going on the ground and actually searching really hard too. In fact, one of the fathers of the victims was out searching for his son when in this rainy conditions he lost control of his car on the muddy road and crashed into a tree and died, which made the government even less likely to let people help with the search. At the same time, the airline began notifying next of kin that their family members were missing. And when Julian's father got the information, it took a couple days because he was at the research center. He actually said, his reaction was, "Oh no, you must be mistaken because I told my wife never to fly Lanza, so there's no way that could be my wife and daughter," which is just heartbreaking. As day 3 comes and goes, Julianne continues to work her way following the stream. The stream itself is only about 20 inches wide, and so in several places, either the undergrowth grows over it, or there's logs or trees that have fallen over it, which makes it really hard to navigate. Add on top of the fact that she's injured, malnourished at this point, it's not the easiest path. Also on day 3 is the first time she comes across wreckage from the plane. She comes across the propeller that was struck by lightning. See, the path she's chosen to follow is also the debris path of the plane. So over the next couple of days, she's going to see what the plane spit out before it crashed. While she's making her way through the jungle on day 4, she hears the sound of a bird that she recognizes from when she lived in the jungle. And it's a bird called a condor de la selva, and it's a vulture. Now, vultures are scavengers. They scavenge for meat. And so she doesn't quite put it together, but a couple minutes later, while following the stream, she comes across 3 bodies from the wreckage. They're still strapped into their seats, But unlike Julianne, who had the good fortune of when she hit the foliage to flip right side up, these people did not flip right side up. They impacted with the ground head first. And the impact was such force, and the ground was soft enough that they were buried a full 3 feet into the ground. And the only thing that's sticking out are their feet. She can tell from their feet that they're two men and a woman. And she kind of has this horrifying thought for a second that, oh my gosh, what if the female there, what if that's my mom? And so she grabs a stick and like kind of prods at the feet, but the feet have nail polish on them, and her mom never used nail polish, so she has this moment of like, first she feels relief because it's not her mom, and then the second feeling of like, oh, I'm an idiot because of course it's not my mom. My mom was sitting next to me when the plane went down. And this third thought of just like this thought enters into her mind for the first time of, oh, not everybody made it. Like, how many people actually did make it? Of all the people to survive, Julianne was probably one of the best candidates to survive in the rainforest. And the reason being was because of her parents, she had been exposed to the rainforest from a very young age. Even when they were living in Lima, they would go on these trips into the rainforest. And she was expected from a young age to bring her own backpack and carry her weight. They would climb 2 days into the mountain, they would camp there for a week or so, and then they'd come back. And her parents were these zoologists researching the Amazon rainforest. And because they were one of the first operations to do this, there was constantly other scientists and zoologists and explorers in the house. So she learned a lot about the rainforest. In fact, like when she was growing up, you and I, we learned animal names like dog, cat, owl, whatever. She literally learned them by their Latin names. And it wasn't until she went and visited Germany once that her aunts and her grandma taught her their actual, like, their regular names. And when they went to live in the rainforest, like I mentioned before, it was remote. It was 2 days in a car and then 2 days up the river to get to where they were at. There was no running water. There was no electricity. They would bathe in the river. They would wash their clothes in the river. They would cook their food on kerosene stoves, and they had just little huts, which in the beginning weren't even enclosed. And so she learned the sounds of the animals. She learned how to walk to not like step on a poisonous snake or catch a poisonous frog or like which insects to avoid. And so she knew this part of the jungle better than anyone else really would have known this, besides maybe her mom and her dad. Like, if it was me in that situation, I'm pretty sure that on day two, I would have just stepped on I would have seen like a frog, grabbed the frog to try and eat it, and would have died if I had even survived that long. So when day five arrives, she finally reaches the end of the stream she was following. It leads to a river that's about 30 feet wide. It takes her a while to finally reach the river itself because of all the reeds that are blocking the little outlet of the stream, but she's finally in a more open spot. Unfortunately, she no longer can hear the planes flying above her. And because of that, she kind of makes the decision that, well, one of the things she thinks is maybe they already rescued everyone, and so she makes the decision to continue on traveling down the river. Unfortunately, the banks of the river are too full with undergrowth to actually walk on the banks, so she'll have to walk in the shallower parts of the river. But the scary thing is the river, she knows from experience, have stingrays in them, and they like to nest in the shallower parts of the river. And if you step on one, they'll sting you, and it's a poison enough sting that without treatment, she'll die. So she grabs a stick nearby and she'll prod the mud before she walks in it, and then make sure that there's no stingray there, and then she'll walk. And she repeats this over and over again. That way she won't get hurt. Once she finds the river, the days begin to blend together. She doesn't have her watch to really separate it, so it's more of this just kind of haze. Because also at this point she begins to hallucinate. She begins to hear voices or chickens or maybe there's sounds around her, and she can't really trust her own mind. At this point she's run out of the little bag of sweets she has, so the only thing she's doing is she's drinking water from the river, which isn't as dangerous as you would think because the water's moving, so it's not stagnant water, and since there's no people nearby, there's not a huge chance that she would get a disease that would like kill her immediately. However, I think the worst part of her journey over the next couple days are actually the nights, because every single night, one of two things happens. Either it doesn't rain and the mosquitoes just swarm her and eat her alive because she has no protection, and so she's getting bitten up. or it rains and there's no mosquitoes, but it's a cold rain, and so there's no place for her to stay dry, and no matter where she's at, she just gets soaked. And so she really is just completely exhausted because she's not sleeping at all during the nights, and her cuts are beginning to swell up. And on a certain day, she realizes that the cup on her arm, she looks over and realizes there's maggots eating away at it. And try as she wants, she can't get the maggots out of the wound. But that doesn't worry her as much with these cuts, so much as the fact she's now in a river. And maggots can eat away at your wound, but what really can make you lose an arm or a leg from where she's cut is if they get an infection. So she's really worried about this at this point. Eventually, she's too weak to even walk anymore, so she just kind of falls in the river and lets this current begin taking her down river. And because of that, she begins to get second degree sunburns. Her skin begins to bleed in the back. And as she's going down the river, on the sides of the river, there are a lot of places there's caimans. And one of the things from her experience is when you fly by, sometimes the caimans will get startled from this, and so they'll jump into the river. And because she'd grown up in the jungle, she realized that whenever a caiman gets scared, it just goes into the river naturally, and not to splash around or not to go into the woods where she could get lost. And several times they even like will bump into her because they'll swim right past her or right under her, but she just held her breath and nothing happened with them. On day 10, Julianne falls asleep on a gravel bank, and when she wakes up, she sees what at first she thinks is a hallucination, but turns out to be real. And she sees a little boat next to a hut. So she swims over to investigate, and sure enough, it's a little boat with a tiny outboard motor, a small little hut with a tarp inside, as well as some gasoline. And she contemplates maybe not using the boat, but realizes, well, one, she didn't want to steal somebody's boat. And two, in her weakened condition, she was worried she might flip the boat or get lost or something. And so what she does is she grabs the gasoline, pours it on her wound in her arm with the maggots, and gets a lot of them out. And then she grabs the tarp and curls up in it and falls asleep. And she says this is the first time in about 2 weeks she actually gets some sleep because she can't get rained on and the bugs can't get to her. When Julianne wakes up, the only thing she can do is wait. And it's not until later in that evening a group of forest workers come to the hut to check everything out and make sure everything's in good condition. And they are shocked to see this German girl who's sunburnt and cut and bleeding there miraculously. They quickly piece together who she is, and unfortunately, because it's so late in the day, they can't navigate up the river. So the only thing that they can do is they can give her some food. Unfortunately, she can't even eat it because of the conditions she's in. They take the rest of the maggots out of the wound in her arm, and they help her go to sleep for the night. One of the things I'd like to mention before I continue is that when Julianne recounts her story in her book and in her interviews, one of the things that I find so fascinating is that she remembers everybody's names, and not just their names, but what they are like and their personalities. To keep things simple, I'm not going to be listing everybody by their names, but I think it tells a lot about what everybody means to her in this experience. Is the fact that when she wrote her, like even her autobiography about this, she wrote it 40 years after the events and still knew everybody and had lots of friendships with them. And I think that's one of the coolest things. So when the morning comes along, they are finally able to get her in a boat and they begin traveling up the river. It takes a couple hours and they get to a small village there. And when they're helping her out of the boat, walking through the village, a lot of the kids and even some women begin screaming because one thing she didn't realize is that her eyes were completely red. You cannot see even the irises because all the blood vessels had burst. So because they're all blood red, it looks like she doesn't even have eyes. It looks just like eye sockets. So imagine the terrifying sight it is to see this blonde hair girl completely burnt, sunburnt, with no eyes, it looks like. And you can imagine how, especially with people like this who are more superstitious, how terrifying it was. A lot of them even thought she was a river goddess there. In the village, though, she's able to get a tetanus shot, and that's about as much treatment as they're able to get her. And then she gets on a flight to a bigger village where there's a group of missionaries who are studying the Indians to translate the Bible into their language, but they have actual medical treatment there and actual doctors. If Julianne had not survived, they never would have found the wreckage site. Like I said earlier, 10 days after they had stopped the search. But when she came back with her story, they're able to find the wreckage. The biggest clue they gave was actually the fact that when she talked about that little stream about the reeds at the that blocked the mouth of it was a huge clue because in the Amazon rainforest there's tons of little streams that lead into bigger streams, bigger rivers. But on this river, there was only one stream that had that type of reed there. So they were able to use that to begin working their way back to the wreckage site. But it's still, even though they knew exactly where it was, it still took them 2 more days to reach there, just to give you an idea. The first the first thing that they tried is a guy tried parachuting in. Fortunately, he parachuted in, he got lost, and it took him 2 days to find his way out of there. So there was a military expedition that just began using machetes and chainsaws and began making their way through the rainforest, and it took them 2 days to finally reach the site. The same day that they reached it, there was actually a group of civilians, like made of family members who had loved ones in the wreck, who used a helicopter and used ropes to rappel down. Once they landed at the site, it then took 6 hours to clear just a spot big enough where a helicopter could land so they could get supplies and bodies in and out. The wreckage itself was a mess. It was spread over 2.5 miles long, and bodies were all over the place. Some were in the trees, some were in their seats where they landed, and it was just horrifying for a lot of people. One of I think the most terrifying things about this or is the fact that while they were grabbing the bodies, keep in mind this has been 2 weeks since the plane has gone down. It's been raining a lot, it's been hot and humid, and there have been bugs and animals around here. So you would expect that most of those bodies would be highly decomposed at this point. However, several of the bodies, including Julianne's mom, are in very good condition for how long they've been here. And the only conclusion that they can draw from that is that Julianne was not the only person who survived the crash. That there were maybe up to 14 people who survived up to maybe even the day before that the wreck was found. And that they either broke collarbones or they had spinal injuries, and for that reason they had never left the wreckage, just hoping somebody would save them. But unfortunately, the rescuers arrived too late for them. The wreck itself, it was such a terrible experience. There was no real investigation that was ever really done. They basically just said, yep, struck by lightning, and then they grabbed the bodies and just moved the bodies out and left the wreckage where it was. And to this day, you can still go into the rainforest and you can still find wreckage from the plane. Despite everything she'd gone through, Julianne was surprisingly in good condition. She was suffering from some things, like she was suffering from malnutrition, but they were able to give her food and she got better. Her eyes healed naturally on their own. They're amazing organs. She had insect bites that healed once she, stopped getting bitten to death by mosquitoes. Her cuts never got infected, so she never had to have anything amputated. They were able to get all the rest of the maggots out of her arm. Her collarbone healed up. The worst thing in recovery, besides just the mental anguish she was going through of survival guilt and missing her mom, was the press. The press hounded her incessantly throughout the entire time. And eventually it got so bad, like she couldn't go anywhere in public. And if she would smile at all, they would like roast her in the press. And then they were there's all these false stories that were coming out that she finally had to leave Peru and just go back to Germany where she would finish her recovery. But she was in Germany, even though she thought she was better at the time, she had all these terrible like she was getting very nauseous. So she finally went to a doctor and they realized she had a swollen liver and she had got hepatitis because of the water she drank, but she was able to recover from that. But it was there they also discovered she had torn a ligament in her leg, and the doctor said she should not have been able to walk with a torn ligament, and they have no idea how she was able to walk for as far as she did and didn't just collapse and die, which is an amazing miracle. Julianne would recover physically, within a year, but it was the mental wounds that took longer to heal. The survivor's guilt. She would wake up for years afterwards with nightmares of the plane crashing or missing her mom. But eventually, with time, those would heal, and she wouldn't let it hold her back. She would graduate in Germany from a university with a doctorate in zoology, and go on to become the head of the state zoology library that they have there. And she would get married, and eventually, and she would continue even visiting the rainforest close to where the research center where the plane went down. And in 2000, when her father passed away, she became in charge of the research center. It's called Panguana. And to this day, she runs that operation there. And it's not one of the biggest research centers. There are way bigger ones in the rainforest, but it's one of the most important because it's so well researched in the sense of like so extensively researched. They know so much about the food, like the food chain and how the animals interact more than any other ones. Because even though you think the Amazon rainforest is one, it's so vast, and depending on where you're at, it's so little of it's actually been fully connected. And so to this day, you still can go out if you really want and you can study there. While researching the video, the coolest thing about this to me is been Julian's perspective about this. When she talks about the wreck, it's not something negative, but although it was a horrifying experience, and I think most of us would look back at this as this terrible moment, she calls it her second birth. It would have been so easy, if any number of things had happened, right, for her to have just died there in the rainforest. If that ligament in her leg worked the way it should have, she should have never got out of there. Or if she hadn't flipped over in the rainforest, she should have died. But for some reason, she continued on. And she holds that perspective. She made a documentary in 1998. Well, she didn't make it. A document was filmed about her. And she was there for it. And her looking back on it, there's a shot in it where it's her walking through this group of butterflies. That's not to say that the wreck and her recovery was this, like, butterfly, sunshine, and unicorn rainbows kind of thing. But that's the way she looks at life, as this gift of every opportunity is this moment of happiness. And the fact that she's still doing this, even 40, 50 years down the line, she's been able to survive. She has a second opportunity. And so often when we get second opportunities, we don't realize that. And she's really chosen to live her life that way. And I find that the coolest thing. I'd like to thank you if you're still watching here. Thanks for watching through the entire video. I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to like the video as well as to subscribe to the channel. And yeah, we'll see you in the next video. Change the world.